Daniel Morris thought the frozen lake was nothing more than a shortcut through the woods. But when he and his younger sister Claire stepped onto the brittle ice, they noticed something pressing up from beneath the surface. At first it looked like shadows trapped in the frost, but as the faces grew clearer, Daniel realized they weren't strangers at all. They were his and Claire's, screaming silently from under the ice. The first time I saw the lake in winter, it struck me as unnervingly quiet. Snow stretched across the landscape in unbroken whiteness, softening the world into silence. The trees stood rigid and lifeless, their branches black against a pale gray sky, like skeletal hands reaching for something just out of reach. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, how untouched, but the longer I stared, the more the peace twisted into something unnatural, something that didn't feel right. It was too still, too perfect, as if the entire scene was frozen in time, not just in temperature. Even the air seemed heavier there, like sound itself had been swallowed. I had wandered farther than usual that day, boots crunching through the fresh snow, searching for some kind of solitude. The deeper I walked, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the faint rasp of my own breath fogging in front of me. That was when I found the lake. It stretched wider than I expected, an oval of solid ice with patches of snow lying in uneven layers across its surface. The sun hovered weakly above, its light fractured by shifting clouds, bouncing off the frozen sheet in broken patterns that shimmered like glass shards. At first glance it was beautiful, but beauty can often hide something darker, and that thought planted itself in me before I even realized it. I stepped closer, drawn by a strange pull I couldn't explain. My boots sank slightly into the crust of snow at the shoreline, the brittle crunch breaking the oppressive silence. I crouched low, brushing away some of the frost with my gloved hand, and peered down into the ice. At first I saw only what I expected, faint cracks spidering outward in delicate, almost autistic patterns, bubbles trapped mid-motion as though the water had been frozen in an instant of struggle. I told myself it was fascinating, like looking at a painting carved by nature itself. But then I noticed something deeper, something darker, almost hidden in the shadowed layers of ice beneath. It wasn't just ice and trapped air. There was shape, definition, the outline of something pressed against the underside of the frozen surface, blurred but undeniable. My heart picked up as my eyes strained to make sense of it. It looked like a limb, a pale smudge that stretched outward, narrowing at the end. I shifted slightly, clearing more of the snow away, and the shape became clearer. Fingers, 5 of them, pressed flat and wide against the ice, as though reaching, as though clawing upward from below. I stumbled back a step, my breath catching painfully in my throat. My rational mind tried to explain what I was seeing. Maybe it was a branch trapped when the lake froze. Maybe shadows from beneath, or ice formations playing tricks on my eyes. But the longer I stared, the harder it became to convince myself of those easy answers. The hand was too perfectly shaped, too real. Every curve, every line of it looked human. The thought of someone trapped down there made my skin crawl. How long had it been there? How deep was the ice? My imagination began to spin horrifying possibilities. I crouched again, against my better judgment, and brushed more snow away. My glove scraped at the hard surface until the ice was exposed in a wide patch. The shadows shifted as the weak sunlight broke through the clouds, giving me a clearer look at the thing beneath. The hand was there, exactly as I had feared. The pale impression pressed flat against the barrier between me and the dark depths below. The more I looked, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a trick. I could see the way the fingers splayed unnaturally, like they had once strained upward with desperate force. A shiver passed through me, not from the cold, but from the realization of how wrong it felt. I straightened quickly, my eyes darting around the tree line as if expecting to see someone watching me. But the forest remained lifeless and still. The world felt too quiet, as though it were waiting for me to notice something more. I turned back to the ice, squinting against the faint glare of the light. That was when I noticed movement, or at least, I thought I did. A shadow flickered beneath the frozen sheet, just for an instant, as if whatever was trapped down there had shifted slightly. My chest tightened. Ice couldn't move like that. Shadows didn't just change shape on their own. I leaned closer, my breath fogging against the surface, trying to convince myself it was nothing but tricks of the light. But when the fog cleared, I saw it clearly. Not just the hand this time. Pressed against the ice, faint and blurred, was a face. Its features distorted through the thick layer, its mouth open as though caught mid-scream, eyes wide and hollow. For a moment I felt rooted to the spot, unable to breathe, unable to move. My heart thudded loudly, filling the silence around me with the sound of my own fear. And then, as I stared, the face seemed to twitch. The lips, frozen in their eternal scream, curved just slightly upward, as though smiling. I couldn't stay away. Even though every part of me screamed that what I had seen wasn't possible, something stronger kept pulling me back. The night after I first saw the frozen face, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, it appeared behind my eyelids, pressed against the ice, watching me with that twisted, almost smile. I would wake up gasping, my skin cold with sweat, only to realize I hadn't escaped it at all. The memory was more vivid in the silence of my room than it had been at the lake itself. By morning, I knew I had to return. I told myself it was to prove I'd imagined it, that in the daylight I would see nothing but ice and snow and shadows. But deep down, I think I wanted confirmation. I wanted to know that what I saw was real, no matter how much that truth terrified me. When I arrived, the air was even colder than before. The trees were covered in a brittle frost that made their branches glitter like glass shards. The lake looked deceptively calm, blanketed with a fresh layer of snow that sparkled beneath the pale sun. For a moment, I stood at the shoreline, just staring, trying to convince myself not to take another step. It looked so normal, so untouched, as though the night before had been a hallucination born of fatigue and fear. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to turn around and leave, but my feet carried me forward. I brushed away the new snow with the edge of my boot, my movements stiff and nervous. The surface cleared slowly, and with each swipe, dread knotted tighter in my stomach. At first I saw nothing, just faint cracks in the ice, bubbles, streaks of frost. My heart began to race with relief. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe I had let my imagination run wild. But then, as I cleared more of the surface, my stomach dropped. The hand was still there. It was pressed against the ice exactly where I remembered, but clearer now, more defined. The fingers stretched wide, palm flat, the skin pale beneath the distorted glass of frozen water. My throat tightened as I realized there was no denying it anymore. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't a trick of light. It was human. My eyes shifted upward, searching the layers of frost and ice, and then I saw the face again. This time, it was unmistakable. The features were warped slightly by the thickness of the ice, but I could see the eyes wide bulging, filled with a look that made my chest ache. The mouth was open, frozen in what looked like a scream that had never ended. The expression was more desperate than I remembered, more alive, as though the moment of death had been captured forever in that one haunting image. The longer I stared, the worse it became. I realized that the body wasn't as deep as it had seemed before. It looked closer, nearer to the surface, as if it had risen overnight. My mind tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me. Ice didn't work like that. Things didn't shift beneath solid layers. If anything, they became trapped, preserved, locked in place until spring thaw. But this face, it was closer now. My breath came in sharp clouds as I leaned down. My gloved hand pressed against the ice, almost as if to assure myself there was still a barrier between us. The cold stung through the fabric immediately, but I couldn't pull away. My reflection flickered faintly in the glassy surface, mixing with the frozen face beneath, making it difficult to tell where my features ended and the other began. The eerie thought came to me suddenly. What if it wasn't just someone trapped under the ice? What if it wanted me to see it? The snow shifted in a sudden gust of wind, spiraling across the surface like white smoke. For a second it obscured the frozen face. When it settled, I blinked in disbelief. The mouth, which had been locked in a scream, looked different now. The lips had curved upward, faint but undeniable, as though forming a smile. I stumbled back, almost slipping on the icy ground, my heart pounding violently in my chest. It couldn't be possible. Ice didn't change, expressions didn't shift, but the face was looking at me, smiling. And in that moment I felt something deep in my bones. Whatever was beneath the lake wasn't just frozen and forgotten. It was aware. It had noticed me. I turned to leave, forcing my legs to move despite the trembling in my muscles. The trees creaked faintly in the wind, but otherwise the world was silent, suffocatingly so. The further I walked, the more I felt like eyes were pressing into the back of my neck, following me with each unsteady step. By the time the lake was out of sight, I was nearly running, desperate to escape the pull of whatever lingered beneath that frozen surface. But even as I left, I knew I hadn't escaped. The image of that smiling face was etched into me now, and something told me it wouldn't stay beneath the ice for long. That night I barely slept again. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that warped face came rushing back. Its frozen expression burned into my mind. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was obsession. I kept wondering if I had really seen its mouth shift, if that smile was real, or if it had been the result of flickering light in my exhausted imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something unnatural was beneath that ice, and now that I had noticed it, it wouldn't let me look away. I told myself I wouldn't return, that I'd stay home, lock the doors, and try to forget. But by the time morning arrived, the compulsion was unbearable. It was as if invisible threads tugged at me, pulling me back toward the lake. Every ordinary sound, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind against the window, carried with it a reminder of the silence I had left behind. Against all reason, I found myself walking the same path again, my boots crunching through snow, my breath hanging in sharp clouds, as if I were heading straight into a trap I had no power to resist. When I reached the lake, the sky was darker, bruised with thick clouds that blotted out the weak sun. The air itself felt heavier, colder, as though the lake had changed along with the weather. I approached the edge slowly, my chest tightening with dread. Even before I cleared the snow, I knew I would see it. The anticipation made me dizzy, as though I were about to pull back a curtain and reveal something that had been waiting all along. The snow this time had drifted thin, so it took only a few sweeps of my glove to reveal the surface beneath. What I saw nearly made me stagger backward. The face wasn't buried in layers anymore. It was closer, so close it almost touched the surface. The pale skin pressed against the underside of the eyes, distorted by cracks. The mouth still frozen open, but the eyes seemed sharper now, more focused. They were no longer hollow smudges, blurred by thickness. They looked alive, staring up directly into mine. I knelt without realizing it, my knees sinking into the snow, my hands trembling as I leaned closer. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I had to see. Reflection of my own face shimmered faintly on the glass-like surface, overlapping with the features beneath. For a horrifying moment, it looked like the frozen figure and I were merging, like the face below was mine. My mouth went dry, my skin crawling. I blinked hard, desperate to separate what was real from what was illusion. And then something happened that froze me completely. My reflection blinked. I didn't. The realization crashed into me like ice water pouring through my veins. I scrambled back a few steps, snow crunching violently beneath me, my heart hammering so loudly it felt like it might burst. I stared at the lake, but the reflection had returned to normal, staring back at me with my own wide, terrified eyes. The frozen figure beneath hadn't moved, its warped features unchanged. For a moment, I thought I might be losing my mind, but no amount of reasoning could erase what I had just witnessed. The air grew still again, that unnatural silence wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I could almost feel something beneath the surface waiting, watching. I told myself I needed to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But my body refused to obey. My boots felt heavy, locked to the snow, as though the lake itself didn't want me to go. I forced myself to turn, to take one step, then another. Each movement was a battle against the overwhelming pull dragging at me. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. But even as I walked away, the thought consumed me. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. For those few seconds, the thing beneath the ice had looked through my face, had used my features as if testing how they fit. By the time the tree line swallowed the view of the lake, my body shook uncontrollably. My breath came in sharp bursts, my throat dry as if I'd been running for hours. The silence lingered, pressing into my ears long after I had left the shore behind. And deep inside, I knew that this wasn't over. Whatever was beneath the lake had noticed me. It had reached out in the only way it could, showing me a glimpse of myself, distorted, trapped in its place. The horrifying possibility gnawed at me with every step home. What if the reflection I saw on the ice was not just an illusion? What if, in some way I couldn't understand, it was a warning? Or worse, an invitation? The next morning the air felt different. Even inside my house, with the windows shut tight and the curtains drawn, I sensed it. A kind of heaviness hung in the atmosphere, pressing down on everything, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I tried to fight the urge to go back, to convince myself that staying away was the only sane choice, but the longer I sat in silence, the more unbearable it became. The thought of the lake, the frozen face, the shifting reflection it gnawed at me like hunger. Eventually, I couldn't resist. My body carried me there without thought, my boots crunching through the snow as if retracing a path carved into my very bones. The forest seemed darker this time, even though it was still morning. The trees loomed closer together, their skeletal branches interlocking like a cage overhead. When I finally reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. The lake didn't look the same. It was no longer a bright sheet of white and pale gray, but a dark, glossy expanse, as though the ice had thinned and turned transparent overnight. The patches of snow that had once scattered across its surface were gone, as if something beneath had swallowed them whole. The entire lake looked like a slab of black glass, veins of pale cracks stretching outward like spiderwebs. I stood at the edge, rooted in place, staring at the dark reflection of the sky above. For a moment, I thought the figure was gone. The surface looked empty, untouched, as though the face and hand had vanished into nothing. Relief swept over me in a brief wave, so powerful that I almost laughed out loud. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined everything after all. But the relief didn't last. The silence around me deepened, heavier than before, and then the sound came. A sharp, splintering crack echoed across the frozen lake. I froze, every muscle tensing, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the natural groan of shifting ice I sometimes heard on lakes in winter. This was different. It was deliberate. The sound repeated, sharp and rhythmic, like knuckles rapping against a door. Crack, pause, crack. Each impact spread thin fractures, outward in jagged lines across the black ice. My stomach turned as the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed as though the entire lake was straining beneath an invisible weight. I could feel the vibrations beneath my boots at the shoreline, a low hum that reverberated up into my bones. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence pressed in again, absolute and suffocating. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the fractured surface, waiting, expecting something to emerge, but nothing moved, nothing broke. It was as though the lake had been testing its strength. flexing just enough to let me know that whatever was beneath it was still there, still waiting. I crouched slowly, against every instinct screaming for me to run, and brushed away a layer of frost near my feet. What I saw made my skin crawl, a handprint. It hadn't been there before. Perfectly formed, 5 fingers pressed flat against the underside of the ice directly where I knelt. My breath hitched, fogging the surface as I leaned closer. The print was so fresh, so vivid, it looked as though someone had pressed against the ice just seconds earlier. The longer I stared, the more wrong it became. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide, distorted slightly as though it didn't quite belong to a human hand. My stomach twisted, a deep primal fear unfurling in my chest. I pulled back quickly, stumbling onto the snow, but my eyes couldn't leave the handprint. As I scrambled to my feet, I noticed something else, something far worse. Another print appeared a few feet away, pressing upward from beneath the ice. Then another, and another. My body went rigid as I realized what I was seeing. The handprint at my feet hadn't been alone. They were multiplying, spreading outward across the surface, faint impressions pressing upward as though dozens of hands were clawing to break free. I staggered backward, my boots slipping on the icy ground, my lungs struggling for air. The silence around me seemed to pulse with something alive, something eager. The surface of the lake didn't break, but the message was clear. Whatever was trapped beneath wasn't just one figure. There were many, and they weren't still. I turned and ran, crashing through the snow, branches whipping at my arms as I fled into the trees. I didn't stop until the sound of my ragged breathing drowned out everything else. Until the lake was hidden behind the wall of forest. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that those handprints were still there, spreading, pressing closer to the surface, and in the back of my mind I knew it was only a matter of time before the ice gave way. By the time I returned home, I was a wreck. My body trembled uncontrollably, my skin felt feverish despite the cold, and my thoughts wouldn't stay still. I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was impossible, that the handprints spreading across the ice had been a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But no matter how many times I told myself that I knew it wasn't true, the prints had been real. They had appeared one after another, deliberate, purposeful, as if something beneath the frozen surface was aware of me standing there and wanted me to see them. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat awake in the dark, the faint whistle of wind against the windows reminding me of that dreadful silence at the lake. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw the face again clearer, smiling in a way that felt wrong in every sense of the word. My heart pounded in my chest as though expecting something to break through the walls, to crawl into my room. And by morning, I realized there was no point in resisting anymore. The lake wanted me back. The thought was insane, but it was the only explanation I had for why I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why my body felt drawn there like iron to a magnet. The forest seemed to recognize me this time, as though it had been waiting. My steps sank heavily into the snow, the crunch of each footfall sounding unnaturally loud in the lifeless air. I felt no wind, no birds, no signs of life, only stillness. When I broke through the trees and the lake came into view, my stomach dropped. The change was unmistakable. The surface was no longer a solid black sheet but a living, shifting mirror of dark water beneath fractured ice. Thin cracks zigzagged in every direction, glowing faintly white against the glossy black, as though the surface was straining to hold itself together. I approached cautiously, every nerve screaming at me to turn back, yet I couldn't. The pull was too strong. When I reached the edge, I froze. There were no more faint handprints scattered across the ice. This time, the entire surface bulged and shifted with faint impressions. Arms, faces, hollow eyes, dozens of them pressed against the underside, their shapes distorted but clear enough to send terror surging through me. They weren't still. They pushed, clawed, writhed, as though desperate to break free. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. And then, amid the chaos of those reaching forms, I saw it, the first figure. The one I had seen on that first day, the one with the twisted half-smile. It was closer now, pressed directly beneath the spot where I stood. Its face was no longer blurred by ice. I could see every detail. Pale skin stretched tight, blackened lips parted in a grotesque grin, and eyes that looked alive, staring into mine with chilling recognition. My stomach turned to stone as realization settled over me. It wasn't just any figure. It was me. The features were warped, distorted by the barrier of ice, but there was no denying the resemblance. My eyes, my mouth, my face frozen mid-scream, trapped below. I staggered backward, shaking my head violently, unable to accept what I was seeing. But the more I denied it, the clearer it became. That figure had always been me. From the beginning, I stumbled, nearly falling as my boots slipped on a patch of snow. When I looked back down, my breath caught in my throat. My reflection wasn't on the surface anymore. The ice no longer showed my face looking down from above. Instead, the reflection staring back at me belonged to the frozen figure beneath, smiling, blinking, alive in a way that I wasn't. Cracks spread outward beneath my feet, sharp and fast, like lightning bolts shooting through the ice. The sound was deafening, a chorus of splintering glass echoing across the silent forest. My heart raced as I scrambled backward, desperate to reach solid ground. But the cracks followed me, faster than my steps, the surface trembling as though something below was pushing upward. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of the ice giving way beneath me. A sudden drop, the shock of freezing water swallowing my legs, then my chest, then my head. Darkness closed in, heavy and suffocating. And yet through the blur I saw them, dozens of pale faces surrounding me, pressing close, eyes unblinking, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. And among them, one face smiled. My face. When I clawed at the surface, the ice above felt solid again, smooth and impenetrable, as though it had sealed itself the moment I fell. My lungs burned, my body thrashed, but my reflection stared down at me from above. It wasn't screaming, it wasn't panicking, it only smiled, watching as I drowned beneath it, as though it had been waiting all along to take my place. The world went black, and I realized something I wish I hadn't. The lake doesn't just trap the dead, it replaces the living, and if anyone else comes close enough to see, they won't be looking at their reflection. They'll be looking at what's already waiting for them beneath.